ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to start out with a question that was asked on the community tab about legitimate suffering and the ego. Presumably this is a reference to Jung's statement that all neurosis is an effort to avoid legitimate suffering. So basically, all neurotic impulses, all neurotic responses, all the various maladaptive coping mechanisms that people develop would come down to an effort to avoid legitimate suffering. So in this context, what makes suffering legitimate? It's an interesting question. And also, what effect does that have on the human ego? Legitimate suffering would be, in my interpretation, in my view, everything that a person simply must go through in life. Everything that is just a part of what human life is all about is legitimate suffering. If it must be endured, then it should be endured. How do you know? Well, it's going to be one of those big questions in life as we make our way through it, from beginning to the end. Is like, is this suffering legitimate? Is this suffering necessary? Maybe one good place to start from is that people do suffer. Human life has suffering built into it. You will suffer. I will suffer. We will suffer. There will be disappointment. There'll be heartbreak. There'll be pain. And I don't know, for some people hearing that, they might think, well, that's a really redundant thing to say. Obviously, that's the case. Why don't we just focus on the good and make life as fun as possible? To which I would reply, it might seem redundant to you, but to many people, they live in denial of that simple fact. And when you're in denial of the simple facts of life, you become sick. You become very mentally sick. And you develop neuroses and you develop neurotic responses to cope, because you're trying to live in a fantasy and you're trying to force your fantasy version of the way life should be onto life. And you're trying to force people into your fantasy version of the way life should be, and it will cause you enormous suffering. I think this is most easily and clearly illustrated when we think about the suffering of other people, especially people that we care about. It's very healthy and quite a release of a burden to be able to say, well, the people around me are supposed to suffer. Well, supposed to suffer. That makes you sound like a sadistic lunatic. The people around me will suffer, and that's the way it's supposed to be. Your children will suffer pain. Your loved ones will suffer pain. Your partner will suffer pain. Whoever you care about will suffer, and it's okay. It's okay. You should help them. Obviously, you should help yourself. You should reduce suffering. You shouldn't fetishize it. But it is perfectly legitimate for people to suffer. It's perfectly legitimate for your life to suck sometimes. Again, the detractors would say these are moot points. This is a redundant statement, but it isn't in an environment where people have clearly come to adopt an ideological stance that there should be no suffering. There's no such thing as life without risk. There's no such thing as life without pain. There's no such thing as infinite life. There will be sickness, there will be decay, and there will be death. And I don't find that depressing, personally. What I find anxiety inducing is when I try to live in accordance with other people's wacky approach to life, where they act like they're infinite, and they act like people are never supposed to get sick, and they act like people are never supposed to die. And I think, God, I can't really cope with that. It feels neurotic. It feels kind of crazy. So, and crazy making as well to be around. So if we switch stance for a second and we say, okay, I've done this when I've been coaching people, and they talk about the people in their lives going through pain, and I just remind them, I just say, The people around you are going to suffer. There's nothing you can do about it. That's part of human life. They're going to suffer. There will be illness, there will be death, there will be disappointment, there will be heartache. And you're powerless to protect them, really. You should do what you can, of course. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do what you can, but you do need to accept that that's what it is. And the suffering that is legitimate is the suffering that is necessary. The suffering that is legitimate is the suffering that leads to growth, that leads to character development. The suffering that is illegitimate is suffering that is not necessary and that doesn't lead anywhere, that leads to, people becoming twisted, masochistic, or traumatized. That's now illegitimate suffering. So Jung's point was, when we avoid legitimate suffering, when we avoid the realities of life, I think Jung also said something along the lines that it's the psychoanalyst's sole job to bring the client back to truth. There's a kind of a Zen Buddhist stance on this, which is like, if you can accept reality just as it is, free from illusion and delusion and story, you'll be in a much more secure headspace and be living a much more sane life with a lot less suffering in it, if you can face reality just as it is without trying to turn it into something that it is not and can never be. So that's legitimate versus illegitimate suffering. What's the effect on the ego? So if we say Jung's point was about denial, and we say Jung was saying, when we try to run away from the facts of life and we try to escape the fact that suffering occurs and that is legitimate, we are then in denial of reality. If a human entity is going through time and they're repeatedly in denial of reality over and over and over and over and over again, and you imagine that reality denial is taking place across a spectrum, is there like an end of the spectrum where they hit the wall and they go, oh, well, I'm going to stop denying reality now? Yes, if something stops them. If an external factor, a person or a scenario says, right, that's the end of that fantasy, then yes. But if you're in an environment where no, there is no end to the reality denial, which is the reverse of saying the fantasy, the ongoing fantasy of life, because a lot of people are living a blue pill dream, a blue pill, masturbatory, hedonistic, narcissistic dream that is the equivalent of adult thumb sucking, where they're just like, none of this stuff will ever happen to me. It'll all happen to somebody else. And I'm never going to die. I remember hearing that years ago in 2015, I think it was. I think it was on YouTube. Somebody saying people live as though they're never going to die. And I thought, that's nonsense. Everybody knows that they're going to die. But that wasn't the point that the speaker was making. He was saying that people live as though they will never die. They live as though they're immortal. They make decisions as though they're immortal. And there's a subtle but huge difference there. It's not that people think that they're going to live forever. Cognitively, they know. But you can create a split. Again, back to psychoanalysis, Jung and Freud. You can create a split. Slavoj Žižek, or trained psychoanalyst, dubbed it the fetishist split. You can know and not know at the same time. And in this scenario, you can know something cognitively, but you don't really live it at the emotional core level. So it's split away from you. It's pushed away. And if somebody says, do you know you're going to die one day? You'll be like, of course I know I'm going to die one day. And then you look at them and you go, but you live in no way as though that were true. You live in no way as though that were true. You asked what legitimate suffering is and what the impact on the ego is. If we're avoiding legitimate suffering and we're pumping up a fantasy-based version of reality that is blue pilling, adult thumb sucking, masturbatory, and sort of self-soothing, a self-soothing view of reality, inside of that space, the ego can grow to monstrous proportions with monstrous mutations on it, because there's no hard edges to keep the ego clipped. In fact, you're almost encouraging ego explosion and ego mutation by trying to live that fantasy and trying to impose that fantasy on reality and on the people in your sphere of influence. There is a term for this. It is called unhealthy narcissism. Again, thank you, Dr. Freud. It's his concept. Narcissism is his concept. He's the first person to identify it. He dubbed it narcissism after Narcissus from the Greek myth. So when we seek to run from that which is our burden to carry, and we all have a burden to carry, we can only run from reality by running into fantasy, Alice in Wonderland. And the further into the fantasy and the harder into the fantasy and the longer into the fantasy we run, the sicker we get and the more our ego will distort and grow in size. It will become toxic. It will become monstrous. I believe in the times in which we are currently living, we see this broad scale. We see this en masse. En masse. This is the way the majority of people are living, in a fantasy, running like hell away from reality, and doing a lot of damage to themselves and the people around them in the process, because it's a miserable place to live. I know, I lived it for years. It's miserable. Every, sin was the first word that sprang to mind then. Every sin, every corruption, every addiction, every bad habit, every denial, every reaction formation flourishes in that darkness, in that wet, dark, lightless space into which no light may ever access, because you're hiding yourself from the truth, and you're hiding parts of yourself from the light of truth. And you can get very, very sick like that. And I think that's what we're seeing en masse. Whole swathes of people, whole nations of people living in denial, living in a fantasy, desperately trying to escape their burden, desperately trying to escape legitimate suffering. It's almost like they hope that they can. It's magical, it's spiritual, it's witchcraft in a sense, the dark arts. They appear to me to be attempting to fly out of their bodies and to push themselves into another reality or into another, like a collective body, and in so doing escape their responsibilities and their burdens, and maybe even make themselves immortal and eternal through flying into this collective well, it's kind of a deification. We're trying to, they're not really creating gods, because gods are singular, but we're trying as human beings, it seems, to create ideologies and stances and positions that have a godlike function in our lives, that would fill that gaping hole where God or goddess or a pantheon of gods used to be. Name it. Politics, political issues, entertainment, social media, whatever you want. Love, bad romance, sex, negative, toxic attachments to other people, whatever it is. But to me, it feels like an effort to, it's magic. It's an effort to create black magic. I don't like here. I don't like this me. It's too small. I find being a human alone a narcissistic injury. I should be famous. I should be worshipped. I should be adored. Everybody should know my name. I always get this wrong. People correct me in the comments and I always forget it. The elf queen from Lord of the Rings. Everybody's worst parts of themselves is brought out by the power of the ring. And when they see the ring, we, the viewer, in Peter Jackson's version of the film, of Tolkien's story, we get an insight into how it will corrupt people. So with the Frodo and Bilbo Baggins, we saw these kind, lovable, sort of chipmunk humans who live in nature, but what was in them? Well, they would hoard a little bit, and they could be a bit territorial, and they could be a bit greedy. And those little dark flecks of something that was in the white marble of their soul would be magnified by the ring. Suddenly they would be avaricious. Suddenly they would be very greedy, very selfish, and duplicitous. But it's a story also of heroism. The heroism, not just of facing external enemies in the form of orcs and golems and dark wizards, but facing your own demons, facing your own monsters, and being a monster and seeing that monstrosity and still making the right choice. In a sense, you know, the final act of Lord of the Rings, you could say all those characters who are there are who's the younger one? Frodo. They're all Frodo. They're all Frodo. There is Satan is there, and God is there also. In the moment of his final trial, in the last few moments when he has to face the darkness of the ring, and that's there, you know, in everybody. Was her name Melisandre? Anyway, there are kings who get a hold of the ring or get near to the ring, like Boromir, and he wants to dominate the world and thrust his big broadsword on people's foreheads, and he wants to get all Yang about it. And then there's, I think it's Melisandre, and she goes into this. It's terrifying. It's really well shot. This moment where she shifts, and it's almost like she goes into an emotional flashback. This narcissistic rage, where she talks about being more terrifying and chaotic than the sea itself, and she's going to be this force of nature, and everybody will fear and love me at the same time. And it's vain, it's vanity, it's narcissism. She wants to be adored and feared. She wants to be the most beautiful. She wants to elevate from elf queen to eternal immortal goddess. I think there's a little bit of that in all of us, a little bit of the potential for that would be, in the Jungian sense, anima possession, where the female part of us would possess us and would be driven and completely insane by that lust for the power of being adored. And that, I think, is the time that we are living through at the moment. Previous to that was probably broad scale animus possession, and now it's broad scale anima possession, it seems to me. Which is why a particularly obnoxious, crude form of somatic image-based narcissism is so rampant and is doing so much damage. And who's it doing the most damage to? Young girls. Young girls. Social media usage does the most amount of damage to teenage girls. There's no question about that now. There's the studies that I've cited elsewhere where they could say with girls between the ages of 10 and 15, when they interacted with content on Instagram, if they saw a picture of a good-looking older girl, even if they wrote something positive and gave it a like and were cognitively happy that that girl existed and that that picture existed, they would experience very intense feelings of anxiety and depression in the minutes that followed. So whatever we have inside of us that is disavowed, that goes into the unconscious, can come back exaggerated and can completely possess us. There's a story, it's contested, but it's a nice piece of poetry in the Islamic tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, having, in some versions, I think it's the Archangel Gabriel comes down from heaven and opens his back, takes out his heart, and cleans the specks of dirt from his heart. So his heart is said to be completely pure. Yes, there are other versions where it's through his chest, but the first time I heard it was through the back. And I thought it was, which is where the angel wings would attach if you were an angel. I thought it was it's a nice metaphor. It's a nice piece of poetry that points to something that is useful, that there is darkness in the human heart, and we need to be aware of it. And in a space of disavowal, in a space where fantasy is prevalent and we can lean into fantasy, and we're engaging heavily in disavowal and we're hiding ourselves from the truth and we're hiding the truth from others, which is the etymological root of the Arabic word kufar. Most people think it means unbeliever or infidel, but originally it meant to cover or to hide. And, you know, in that sense, poetically speaking, we're in the age of the kufar. We're in the age of the people who hide the truth, hide it away, hide it in the darkness. And those wounds hidden fester. And the wounds grow. The wounds grow. They don't heal. What disease is it? It's a skin disease. I think it's impetigo, where it's identified by, you know, a gold, it's gross, sorry, a gold crusted wound that doesn't heal. The edges of the wound can actually start to recede. It's pretty horrifying. Those of you who've done BJJ on dirty mats, like I have over the years, will be familiar with this condition. When you get a few scuffs on a mat that hasn't been bleached in a month, you'll develop some nasty rashes. So that's what I think about legitimate suffering and about the ego. When we avoid legitimate suffering, we force ourselves to plunge into fantasy because we're trying to avoid reality, where legitimate suffering comes from. Being plunged in fantasy, being plunged in the deep, dark forest of the unconscious is a space where all the impurities and wounds will fester and will grow. And there's no such thing as a well-formed, strong ego with good boundaries that's formed in darkness, and in the darkness bind them. There's just no way. There's just no way. It can only be formed in light. It can only be formed through honest, open interaction with reality. And that's why, you know, having a strong commitment to being in reality and accepting reality as it is, and to truth, is probably a good starting point. Say, okay, I believe in truth. I believe, as it said in John, can't remember the number, and the truth will set you free. I think that that's completely true. I think it's as true now as it was 2,000 years ago. The truth itself has a healing quality to it. Those who bend it, those who run from it, those who hide from it, it's a sin. That's a sin. I'm not, as I mentioned, religious points here today. You know, I'm not a particularly religious person, but I think that these particular tenets have great value. It goes beyond religion. It goes beyond the need to have faith in something that you can't see and have never seen any evidence of in your life. We can see evidence of this. It's worth believing in. It's worth believing in the idea that the truth will set you free. If you don't believe that, why would anybody bother with psychology? Why would anybody ever bother with psychotherapy or psychoanalysis? If you don't believe fundamentally that the truth will set you free, I don't know, just descend into a fantasy like everybody else. Watch more TV, plunge into social media, get yourself a couple of accounts, have a blast. Okay, this is a live for Q&A. I've spoke for 23 minutes. Now I'll take some questions. If you can please make them one sentence long and end in a question mark, that helps me in my life. Okay. Oop. Okay. Cooley says, you touched on this in a recent tentacle croissant video, but could you elaborate why it is so traumatic to see people, male or female, who are better than you? I can only, this isn't my field of expertise. I don't really have a field of expertise. So you'd need a developmental psychologist to explain this better than I can. As I understand it, teenagers, really their brains and their central nervous system and their hormones and everything is kind of, in the teen years, in your adolescent years, is forming around hierarchies, and hierarchies of dominance, which could be set by physical strength or by beauty and attractiveness. So if you're receiving a message that is you're not good enough, it becomes a kind of if you're receiving messages from social media that you're not good enough, it becomes a kind of digital self-harm. So why is it traumatic? When you see a photoshopped image, very well posed, very well lit, skillfully done image, say you're a 12-year-old girl, and you're coming into some pretty difficult and confusing years in a developing human being's life, and you're seeing a lot of images of just really incredibly unlikely looking human beings, particularly females, who you on the one hand admire, and on the other hand are probably terrified of, and on the third hand that you don't want to be. And you look and you say to yourself, my God, this girl is so amazing, so pretty, so her body is so whatever. Because at that age, you're becoming aware of your own attractiveness to a degree, and you become body aware. Where up until that age, you'd be like, I don't care what my body looks like. I just want to run around and go play, and as long as it lets me do that, I don't really care. Like, what does it mean, good looking or not good looking? You don't care when you're a kid. But then you do start to care, and then you will know what suffering is. Then you'll know suffering as soon as that terrible moment of awareness dawns in you, that there is this, there is the opposite sex, there is this thing called sex, there is this thing called sexual attraction, and a whole world of power dynamics just trickles down from that one issue. It's a lot of pressure anyway, in any situation, but then to be bombarded with images, highly unrealistic images, highly sexualized, bordering on soft porn images of women, and you look at yourself through your own probably distorted self-image, and then you look at them and you make a quick comparison, probably takes a few fractions of a second to do, and you say, because here's another thing, as human beings, we don't know that the person in the picture isn't a member of our tribe. At the level of biology, we don't know that, we don't really register that even they don't look like that. That's just a well-posed picture that's been photoshopped. Or maybe they do look like that, but so what? We think, this is my neighbor, this is my tribe member, this is who I need to be like in order to exist. If you organize reality in your head that way, or rather, if it is organized through you, for you, then yeah, it's deeply traumatic. Listen, young girl, who now everybody who's watching this is being asked to be in this thought experiment, you don't exist unless you can approximate that image. You don't really exist. Nobody's going to want to hang out with you. You won't have friends. You'll never have a boyfriend. You'll never have a husband. You will never really have a life. Nobody's going to look at you unless you can get close to that. Now, if we can compassionately, if not, perhaps not empathetically, given the dangers of empathy, but with compassion, if we can sit in that space, you'd say, wow, yeah, no, that's brutal. You could actually say these images are brutalizing. They're emotionally brutalizing, which is why if I was asked 5 days ago, would I let children have social media accounts? And I said, absolutely not. I know too much about it. Absolutely, I wouldn't let them have smartphones. There'll be the weird kids at school. Yes, but they won't be mentally ill. Yes, but they won't suffer the way all the other kids suffer. They won't be driven completely fucking bonkers by it. So no, nobody under the age of 18 needs a smartphone, and certainly nobody under the age of 18 needs access to social media. So there you go. Do me little old man rant. Get off that bloody social media. But Richard, isn't YouTube social media? Oh my God, it is. Yeah, Cheryl says they have to for online learning now. Aye. That they do. Well, they don't need phones. You could have a laptop for it and then monitor their use. The laptop, you put timers on them and passwords and stuff on them. I wouldn't let a kid have a phone. But I am a weirdo. That's probably why you're here. can you explain the pain body? Well, that's Eckhart Tolle's concept. My understanding of what Eckhart Tolle is speaking of is through his perceptual filters, he's probably talking about just emotional flashbacks, pain. When people change emotional states, their perceptual filters change, and they change, their personality changes, and they show up as a person who is in pain and who causes pain. And he sees it as the pain body. It's, I think, well, German's his first language, and his entryway into English was through Cambridge. I think he did English literature at Cambridge University, so quite arcane English. And so he means, through his use of the term pain body, as I have come to understand it, it's like an energy field, a chi field of suffering. And it's a useful model. It's, to me, it's not as useful as thinking in terms of emotional flashbacks, but it is useful, very useful. A chi field. So you would get like hashtag triggered, you would alter your emotional state, and then your whole field would shift, and your persona and your perceptual filters would alter. Charles says, with a new episode from Tentacle Croissant, we could call it flesh suit anxiety. Yes, I like that. Jargon. Any thoughts on Sam Vaknin's theory that makes a connection between the rise of narcissism and the explosion of transgender people? Does this relate to collectively converting from animus to anima? There is a connection, but it's a really complicated one. And I've been wanting to do it for about 6 months, and I've never got round to it. I'll speak to Pierre about it this week, because it's a video that needs B-roll, and it needs planning, and it needs explanation. I actually wanted to talk about Hermaphrodite as a deity. It's a really, really interesting story from Greek mythology, and it really reads like a syntactic exposition of what happens between human beings in attachment at conscious and unconscious levels, and the way the ancient Greeks used, because these gods are all used, they all had a purpose, the way they used hermaphrodite. So we say nowadays hermaphrodite, but it's Hermes Aphrodite. The hermaphrodite was used, had particular ceremonial functions that are really interesting, super interesting, and I want to talk about it because it's extremely pertinent. But that's a fused god. That's Hermes, the god of boundaries, and the god who was given special permission to transgress boundaries, molded with the goddess of love. I mean, that alone is really interesting. And their union, I'm pretty sure, I need to do the research on it again, I think it's a punishment. I think it's a punishment, because I think Aphrodite fell in love with Hermes, but he kept flying away because that was his nature. And she said, I want to be with him forever. And somebody went, all right, careful what you wish for. And they were melded. There's more content in the Greek myths as far as narcissism goes than just Narcissus himself. Even if you just look at who Narcissus was involved with before he fell in love with his own reflection, there's more to these stories. They're very, very clever. They're very, very deep. I hated them for years because they were forced on me at school, so I didn't really look at them. So yeah, I would cover this in a video. There is a relationship there, but it's, if I come out with a video and I say, hey, here's the relationship between the explosion of transgenderism and the rise of narcissism, that's how you get cancelled. That's not smart. So I would just talk, probably, I'd be really careful as I step through that. But the first place I'd start is with Hermes Hermaphrodite. That's where I would like to start with it, because it's a fascinating myth. So yeah, thanks for your question. Sadasivuni. Wow. Adithyavadan. What are your thoughts on people being too objective and scientific and not leaving room for any subjectivity? Yeah, we have terms for that in psychology. It's not good to be too solely data-based. Al-Qaeda, the base. It's not good. But we don't live in a time where that's the main problem. The main problem is that people are entirely too subjective. And we're moving into dangerous times. We're moving into anti-science times, anti-data times, anti-history times, anti-fact times. We are really seriously moving into times where you can see over the next hill a new Inquisition. No joke, new Inquisition. It's not that far away. And a Stalinist type revolution with elements of full-blown ethnocentric racist ideologies that would, make Goebbels very proud. It's just around the corner. It's not far. We're not far away from that. So I'm more concerned about that. I wish people would be, generally speaking, people need to be more objective and more scientific. But yes, it's not good to lose subjectivity, because, that's where poetry and art and intuition and emotion and music and dance, they come from these places. Good things come from there as well. Annie says, Richard, how often does a cluster B exploit the opposite sex in crappy relationships to hide being gay? That sounds like you're talking about a specific case. Perhaps a case that relates to your individual experience. Let me read that again. How often? Oh, 2 or 3 times a week. I really don't know. The key, Annie, with the cluster B spectrum is the cluster B spectrum focuses on reactions from other people, and typically around some form of a power dynamic. When we're talking about narcissists, their main focus is narcissistic supply. If they were seeking to hide being gay, and they were engaged in heterosexual relationships, then all the heterosexual relationships they were engaged in would be exploitative, and so it would be 100% of the time would be an answer to your question. That's probably the best answer I can give you. Thank you. Why is it so easy to fool yourself and believe that a narcissist can change rather than to just move on? Usually because of love and attachment. So there's the emotional component. Which is love. Let's never underestimate love. And very frequently there's a power dynamic issue there. There's a reason, kids, money, house, job, fame, some benefit that comes from being with that person as well. So people will often find themselves in a situation where it's really very painful to accept the reality, because the NPD has made it. They've stacked the cards in their own favor and made it so if you ever red pilled from the spider's web that you were trapped in, it would be enormously painful for you. So yes, it's easier in that sense to just say, okay, let's let this show continue. I did it for years. Wasted years, my friends, wasted years. Evengrow says, science has become another magic word. Too many people believe that simply invoking the word makes it true. Yes. Yes, that's true. And there's corruption in science. Some of the meta-analyses of scientific papers across all disciplines said as many as 50% of them had huge faults and evidence of bias. Other meta-analyses have indicated that, you know, people are just making up the data, or they've been paid to do the research. But that's not an excuse to abandon it. That's not an excuse to just say, oh, it's all a load of crap. We don't have to listen to science anymore. Nor is it a reason to switch your brain off. If somebody says, well, this is what the scientists say, it should still be challenged. That's science. Science encourages challenge. That's why things aren't writ, you know, into being by a man in a big hat and a robe. There are published papers that are peer-reviewed that can then be contested in a public forum in accordance with certain rules. Okay. Okay. And Trast asks, what is the connection between cptsd and jinn, demons, and magic in your view? I tend to keep all of that separate. Jinn, be they good jinn or bad jinn. I mean, when I do this type of work, I find I'm most efficient and most effective if I am functioning brutally as like an engineer. I go, okay, there's a system fault that needs fixing. Let's fix it. Demons and jinn are, you know, it depends on what tradition you're in and who you're talking to and what age and what these things are. They have loose terminology. You know, do I actually naively believe in demons or jinn myself? Not really. It's not really a part of my worldview. You know, I referenced this before. It's something I got from Jordan Peterson. It's actually a really good point. One of the few points that he made when taking a beating from Sam Harris that was actually a good one, which is, if you believe something is true, but you don't act as if it's true, do you really believe that it's true? So I lived in Malaysia and I lived in Kuala Lumpur, and bits of Kuala Lumpur are quite spooky. I'd already heard from people that like you can feel spirits in the air, and there's a lot of magic there. There's a lot of magic practice, and there's a lot of religions there with a full spectrum of all the religions. So you can walk through an apartment block and you'll go past like a Hindu apartment door where it looks like full-scale magic is going on. Like they're drawing circles in salt outside the door, and there'll be I don't know the word for it, but it looks like a swastika, but I think it's the other way around. And there'll be, you know, then you walk past the Chinese house and there'll be mirrors there. And this is all about warding off evil spirits from the door of the apartment. And then you walk past a Muslim house and it'll say in Arabic over the door, there'll be words there that are there to keep evil spirits at bay. And I was living with my mate and his girlfriend, and I lived there I stayed with them for 3 months. And we lived in an apartment that was right over a graveyard. And my mate's Muslim, she's Muslim, and she was saying, you know, I'm really scared. I've seen ghosts I've seen ghosts and I believe in demons, and I think demons come into my room sometimes. And I was like, okay, so, you know, obviously your worldview as a Muslim is these are bad jinn. These, yes. Okay. So these are bad jinn, but you're a Muslim. Yes. So you believe in angels. Yes. Do you ever call on angels to protect you? No. Do you ever ask God to send these bad jinn away? No. And I was like, well, like, why have you only got one half of the system in operation here? You've committed to a system and now you're only seeing one side of it. That doesn't make sense. Similarly to, it's a thing that I often think about, is like in my own life, if you ask me about jinn, I'll go, yeah, I understand what jinn are. Yes, I understand what demons are and demonology. I understand it, but I'm not thinking about that in my day-to-day life. So do I really believe it? If I'm in a situation where things look really, really bad and I'm wondering like if I might get hurt or I might die, I'm not really thinking religiously. I'm not cognitively, I'm there. I'm like, yeah, that's cool. I dig it. Yep. But emotionally, it's just not part of me. It's just, so if I sat here and said, oh, cptsd is a result of demonic possession and you know, parental neglect is a intergenerational trauma flashback to, you know, like witches' spells and stuff. I just don't, it just has no weight for me. Maybe it used to more, but it would be wrong of me to say that it does now when it doesn't. The way people used to talk about demons and jinn and the way people talked about witches and spells sounds like abuse. It sounds like, you know, somebody mentioned the pain body before. So you have Eckhart Tolle's pain body. We have Pete Walker's emotional flashbacks. And then this one over here is talking about jinn possessing the body. And this one over here is talking about demonic possession. And really the cluster of symptoms that you're describing is not that different. And to be quite honest with you, oftentimes the recipe for healing is not that different. You know, saying prayers, engaging in fasting, doing a penance, talking to a priest and all the rest of it, it's not a million miles away from what happens in psychotherapy and life coaching. Not really. So there you go. Slightly long-winded answer. I don't... what I would like to say whenever people bring up jinn and demons is like, if you believe in jinn and you believe in demons, then you're coming from a religious cosmology that doesn't just have bad things in it, it has good things in it. And for years I've had this ongoing debate. It's always with my Muslim and Christian friends. I'm like, well, none of you call on angels. Well, very, very few people I've met. I'm like, but they're in your system, yeah? Yeah. And you believe, yes. You naively believe the Bible is the word of God, yes. But you would never pray and ask for help. You don't pray for your depression to be lifted. You don't pray for angels. But I'm not trying to be a dick. Like, whatever your religious beliefs are, it's cool with me. But why are you eating like one half of the cake and not the other? Ask for help then. Pray to Jesus for help. You could clip this out, and I would. The people that think this channel have gone another direction, but I like working with Christians and Muslims because there's somewhere I can start with in terms of recovery that's concrete, even if they've fallen out with their religion. But if you're a Christian and you have mental health issues, and you tell me that you're a devout Christian with mental health issues, and you don't pray to Jesus every day for alleviation from your suffering, I don't know in what sense you're really a Christian. Let me be very, very careful in explaining that. It's the Jordan Peterson point I'm making here. If you say you believe this, but you do this, what has more weight is what you do, not what you say you believe. I don't talk about jinn and demons, and I don't think about them. So I can do, but I'm not really, they're not part of my life. So do I believe? Not really. Obviously, I don't really believe. I'm not sat here thinking about God. I'm not sat here praying to God. If I have a problem, I'm like, oh, I better pray. But if you can and you do, fantastic. Do it. Get on with it. But do it in an intentful and in intentful way. Or if you're not Christian or Muslim, but you believe in demons, do you are you one of these people who not you, Han, not you, question asker, but I'm always like, well, if you believe in Satan, you have to believe in God. You can't. I mean, you can't just believe in evil. You have to believe in good as well, because otherwise, if all there is evil, if you take a Gnostic viewpoint and you drag it all the way to the very end, and you say, no, I'm a pure Satanist and I only believe in evil. And I'm like, well, then there's no evil anymore, is there? No, there's evil, but that evil's all there is. Well, if evil's all there is, that's not evil. That's just the way life is. Good and evil are value judgments, and there are value judgments along a polarized spectrum. If the world is nothing but evil, it's not evil, it's just the world. Teresa asks, what are your beliefs spiritually? I don't even know now that they are sort of spiritual beliefs. I have big questions. I don't know. I think you'd call them spiritual. They're almost in the realm of sci-fi or something. I'm probably more convinced that this is some kind of a simulation than that this is, I don't know, God's testing ground, or we're all in God, what do you call it? Purgatory, like in Dr. Faustus, or is it Dr. Faustus? Christopher Marlowe's Faust, where Faust says to Mephistopheles, "Oh, you've come up from hell to see me," and Mephistopheles says, "Why, this is hell, and nor am I out of it." Which is a weird line, because you're like, what's Marlowe telling us? That Mephistopheles believes that Earth is also hell. So it's not really my bag. Maybe it was at one time, but it's not really that now. I know that the story that we're living by right now is incredibly limited and silly. The science-based materialist story is that we live by is really silly, really limited, and just there's so much that it doesn't account for. That doesn't mean you kick it out. You stay rational and you go, hey, this story has holes in it. The religious-based, spiritual-based stuff, I wish I believed in it more. I really do. I think I derive a lot of comfort from it, and I am discomforted because I just can't do it. There's none of it I accept naively. Anything that requires me to accept it naively, I usually spit it back out inside of a couple of days. So I don't really know that I have spiritual beliefs per se and as such. Christina asks, can a person with NPD admit to themselves that they're suffering from NPD? Yeah. There's God, what should you look up? I think if you in your favorite search engine and you put in the world's simplest narcissism test, it's recent. It's from 2016 or 2017. It's from an American university, and they basically read out to people a list of narcissistic traits and then asked them, does this sound like you or not? And they go, yeah or no. And it was apparently, according to their published research, it was as accurate as giving them a full-blown hour-long test for NPD traits. So yeah, they can admit that they have NPD. Some people with NPD are very proud of it. They see it as an advantage. They see it as an evolutionary advantage. SmileBulina. The truth we have to follow or accept is our personal truth. So it's a relative truth that kills the illusion, right? I don't understand that question. Let me try that again. The truth we have to follow is our personal truth. No, not really. I don't think there is I don't think it's useful to think in terms of a personal truth and then group truth. Just go for truth, because if you're saying that it's a personal truth, by implication, it's not the truth for everybody. And you really want to be trying to drill down to just that which is true. Don't split it, because before long you'll find yourself in a relativistic quagmire, and you like relativism is inevitable, but it should be fought against. It should be fought against. We should try to find actual truth, because again, the spectrum issue, the further down the spectrum of relativism you go, the sooner you'll land at the false conclusion, well, nothing means anything anyway, so why try for anything at all? And that conclusion is inevitable if you step into relativism and start walking down that path. You just go, well, nothing means anything, it's all interpretation, which is not true. That's not the truth. So yeah, I would say go for actual truth. Go for actual truth, and be very, very careful of relativism. It is inevitable, and I'm not denying that some truths are relative. What I'm saying, it's like when I say there's no such thing as justice. I'm not saying, screw it then, let's not bother with justice. I'm saying, let's try to be fair. Let's move towards justice whilst accepting that we'll never get there. It's simply not possible. It's not possible for humans to achieve justice. Oop. Sorry, guys. There's good questions here, but I'm not quite in full control. Life a Beach said, "Why do you support the murder of puppies, sir? Just answer the question." Yes. Yep. Okay. Mary RB asks, do you accept that the truth will set you free? Do I accept it? Yeah, I do. I think it is true that the truth will set you free. Might it not be possible that the aversion against accepting reasonably convincing worldviews, such as specific religion, is a hidden cptsd symptom? Thanks, by the way. You have drawn an equivalency between reasonably convincing worldviews and religions. The only religion that has a reasonably convincing worldview, in my view, is Buddhism. And it's not really a faith-based religion. It doesn't require you to naively believe. And so it's not really, in my view, a religion. It may be one of the first birth spasms for science itself, because it is based on pure observation of phenomena, and then seeks to organize an understanding of that phenomena and a working with that phenomena for an end goal, and tries to rid itself of poisoning the well with subjectivity. So to me, it's kind of science. So there is no religion I've seen that has a reasonably convincing worldview. My God, most religions have a completely bonkers worldview that I find about as convincing as a superhero comic. In fact, there's very few superhero comics that are as crazy. I mean, if you actually take on the major world religions and what they believe, and the stories they expect you to swallow whole, it's like, wow, this is... Either these people were in some seriously deep initiation magic ceremonies, and they were fasting for months on end, or they were just taking psychedelics, and it's just trippy. It's really trippy. So I've never seen anything that I would consider reasonably convincing outside of Buddhism. Okay. DeSanti says there is no relative truth. No, if it were relative, it would cease to be truth. It depends on if you mean in terms of objective reality. I think the word truth, and this is where one of the debates where Sam Harris gave Jordan Peterson a bit of a beating at the intellectual level, was a whole 2 hours just on truth. So truth is a word that has a lot of different meanings, and the way the question was phrased before, because we're talking about personal truth, is there is a linguistic formation we have for truth that implies that there is a relative truth. We say, you know, speak your truth to me. What is your truth? What is my truth? But no, truth is truth is truth. Reality is reality. You are right. And yet, that's the way the word gets used sometimes. So when we say circumcision is I don't know. So over here we say circumcision of young boys is barbaric and is basically genital mutilation. We have to be careful saying that, because you go, well, you know, it's kind of relative, because there's a whole bunch of people all across the globe who still do it for their various reasons, and we don't want to offend them, so we'll say the truth is relative. And according to your belief system and according to your history and your sense of your ethnicity and your culture, you may say it's absolutely essential to be circumcised and to have your children circumcised. And under those conditions, we start splitting, and we say, oh, well, you know, truth is relative. but I do personally, I think it's a cop out. I do think it's a cop out, because it can cover crimes. You know, there are cultural and religious practices from across the globe that simply would be considered criminal in every single country, at least in Europe, that's for sure. And I won't mention them here because they're pretty repugnant. Okay, trying to UG Rose says, we're all going into relativism, it seems like, thus everyone doing what they want with no desire to take account for who is pulled into the crosshairs. Yeah, probably the run from reality leads to the submergence in subjectivity, which, I mean, relativism follows on the heels of that, you know, fantasy, subjectivity, and relativism, because it becomes a weapon against truth. Relativism can be a weapon against truth, because you could say, well, you know, everybody has their own truth, and this is the way we've always done it, and we don't want to stop doing it, so this is the way we're going to keep doing it. So yeah, it's dangerous. It's really, really dangerous ground. And I've been saying for a couple of years, like, this is really dangerous ground. When we engage in word policing, we're in dangerous ground. And people go, shut up, it's not that bad. I'm like, if you know your history, you know what this can lead to. So yeah, relativism is it. I accept it. I accept it as inevitable, but it's not good. It is not good. Even mathematicians realize some mathematical concepts can have no proofs as absolute. Yes, but that doesn't mean that there is no truth. Dawn Morris asks, have you considered opening up training for more Spartan life coaches, possibly training some women? Not at the moment. I don't think that's going to happen. at the moment. I think this period of time that we're going through would need to close out or significantly alter before I'd consider doing that. Ike is here and says, hi Richard. Hello Ike. Omara says, I want my question answered. Sniffle, lol. Just write it again. Write it again, mate. Relativism is a path towards authoritarianism. Unfortunately, yeah. I think that's true. SmileBulina says, but how can a truth you don't believe in set you free? It can't. It can't. Only truth can set you free. Reality is reality. Glad I'm being asked about truth. Friggin' Allah. Don't overestimate my intelligence. What idea or thought gives you comfort in times of stress? That I've been through times of stress before and they always pass. And then my brain might go through some reference experiences, some memories of times where I've been stressed out and then it went away and afterwards I felt okay again. That gives me comfort. Pam says, we want truth and we want it now. Indeed. Han asks, isn't Buddhism ironically the religious worldview that is intentionally metaphysically non-concrete? No. How to become peaceful is not the same as finding fundamental truth. Don't you seek the latter? I think you have misunderstood Buddhism. Cameron asks, how can narcissists not be classified as mentally ill when are consciously cause harm? I think they are classed as mentally ill. I would class them as mentally ill. Do you think dismantling emotional trauma is a lifelong struggle? I hope it doesn't take your whole life. I would hope to make it faster than that if I can. And there are other people who can help you to accelerate the process. I think you should suffer and then, be continuing to suffer the after effects of the initial trauma for the rest of your life. I would hope we could do better than that. Jessica Ben says, big passive-aggressive sigh. How dare you, Jessica? TD Hawk says, hello from upstate New York along the Mohawk River. Thank you for this, Richard. Thank you, TD Hawk. I'm sure it's pretty there. Okay. Oop. Do you offer online coaching? I'm afraid I don't anymore. Sorry. Karina asks, says, you rock my socks. Wonderful. Aza asks, how do you really make an NPD understand that he has truly lost you? He seems to keep coming back saying, I miss you every few months and thinks the door is still open. Probably by your meta-communication, through your actions or your inaction, he would realize that you've moved on. If you close the pathways of communication to him and move on with your life, and he realizes that he can no longer just pop back up and say hello whenever he feels like it, then he'll probably realize that he's lost you and he'll move on from that. E, the olive cat, says, do you think religion provides content for narcissism? And could that be why religion is still so popular? It can do. It can do. Anything that puts the religion, some religions can provide a weapon system, unfortunately. That's not what they're intended for, to narcissistic types. But if it puts you center stage, if it puts you, your people center stage, tells you you're special, tells you you'll be rewarded, tells you you're part of an especially wonderful group or an especially victimized group, then yes, it will breed and foster narcissism. If it justifies your bad behavior and protects you from the criticism of others, then yes, it will absolutely foster narcissism. And most major world religions do all of these things. Kayla Kuchler has a good question. Oh dear. So if you see a good question that you like, just copy it and paste it, and I'll try and get to it. Daryl says, what if we stand in our own way of healing? We don't need to be involved when the body is cut, but we can get in the way of our own psyche, spirit healing process. Yeah, definitely. We certainly can. That's why you want to do as much as you can to get calm, be comfortable inside your own skin, you know, be comfortable being on your own, free from alcohol, drugs, anything that props you up. And then your perceptual filters will clear a little bit, and it will be easier for you to get on with your healing process without getting in your own way. Kayla Kuchler, what can I do personally to raise awareness of abuse from cluster B within the justice system? I don't know, my mate. I really don't know. I really don't know. You know, if you want to actually make a change, you may have to go beyond raising awareness. I'm not even sure, you know, when we talk about raising awareness of certain issues, I'm not even really sure what we can do. And when we do try and do things, if it does anything, you know, you want to convince judges and juries and lawyers to actually process cases, and the system itself to process cases with an awareness and an acceptance of cluster B personality disorders and narcissistic abuse. What can any one individual do? Really don't know. I mean, there must be a shift in that direction. Having said that, given that in our entertainment and our films, people are talking about psychopathy and narcissism a lot more, I think the general public awareness is higher. So I'm hopeful. But what you can do as an individual, I really don't know. I've never done it, so I'm not. I have no experience or expertise on that. Ooh. The Shadows Cat asks me a hard question. Do you think the use of social media like YouTube as a distraction to children without parental supervision is a form of neglect? Ooh, I don't know. I don't know if I'd use the word neglect. I don't know which country you're in, but in the UK, if you say neglect, I'm pretty sure that's technically it's a crime. So I don't know. I don't know if I would describe it as neglect. I would say it's not my preferred parenting style. It's not what I would encourage if anybody wanted to ask me. If anybody wanted to make it my business and say, "Oh, Richard, what do you think, oh childless man, who's never done the job, of how I should raise my children?" I'd say probably minimize social media, but let's not demonize social media. I'd also be saying minimize television usage. minimize all screen time. Absolutely. That's just my my dumb opinion. Kayla Kochler says, "Thank you, and don't you touch my pup." I wouldn't. I love dogs. Obviously, and I love puppies. The reference to being a puppy killer before is a joke that's come up a number of times on Tentacle Classroom, which is where you get corralled into this position of being the question passively accusing you of some terrible thing that you would never ever do. Like, you know, how long have you been a racist for? You know, tell us in years, months, hours, and minutes how long you've been a wife beater, a genocidal maniac, you know, whatever it is. So puppy killing was one of them. Jennifer says to Kayla, my advice would be to connect with local women's aid groups to see if they can provide training within the legal sector. So there you go, some practical advice there. Ginger Glue says to Tarantilia, creativity and psychosis. Okay, maybe I shouldn't be reading comments that are not to me, but are to other people. Karameya says, do you still get emotional flashbacks after having done the work? No, but you will still get emotions. Emotions don't disappear. But emotional flashbacks will be infrequent or completely eradicated. But you must have made a pretty high level of commitment for a good period of time, like a year, 18 months, probably even 2 years. And you've got to give yourself a lot of care and a lot of attention for the emotional literacy to develop to the point where the body-mind system doesn't need to rely on emotional flashbacks in order to cope with stress, because that's what it's doing. So you kind of need to restructure your internal system. That's not a small thing. Shay asks, are we not all mentally ill in one way or another? Probably everybody is traumatized in one way or another. I don't know that I'd say that everybody is mentally ill. I sort of see that as being a little bit further along the spectrum. We'd say, okay, that person's actually mentally ill. Like their life, they're not just a bit eccentric, they don't just have a few bad habits, but their life is significantly impacted by the fact that they just can't process their emotions and what they're experiencing. Ooh, here we go. Ooh. The problem is some of you people think I'm cleverer than I am. Here we go. I'll try and deal with this. How to deal with the gap between morality, not leaving alone, knowing an old narcissist who is also a victim, will suffer without narcissist supply and the own need of freedom. How to deal with the gap between morality, not leaving alone. Yeah, I think in a situation like this, I think you've got to sort of distinguish between your needs and the needs of the other person, and realize that you're an adult, they're an adult. You've got needs, they've got needs. You've only got one life. You know, you've got one life. It is your life. It is your time. It's not their time to use. It's yours. So you do have to engage in self-interested action consciously sometimes, especially as a codependent, And yeah, that will cost other people, but it's your life. The Pam says, reading questions aloud with a Scouse accent does help gain insight. It does, you know. Mary RB says, so is it still possible to experience love given today's interactions? Yeah, definitely. It's harder, it's more challenging, but you know, if your boundaries are good and you're still prepared to make an effort, yeah, you can definitely experience love, for sure. Oh, and then somebody else asked, is romantic love still possible? Is romantic love still possible nowadays? And that, like, mate, says, you know, Michelle D. Yeah, I think so. Romantic love, yes, in the sense that you mean, without going off on a big thing about romance, and we need to be very careful with romance. We need to be very careful with that which we consider to be romantic. We probably could do with some post-ideological black pilling of some of our ideas of love, so that we can safely attach with another human being and live together in these fascinating times. Oh, Shiva, thank you for manifesting me in this time and not the other time I specifically asked for. Alex says, thank you very much. Onegaishimasu. Passion Flower asks, do you feel having high IQ contributes to a narcissistic personality, or more likely empathic types? Yeah, a lot of narcissists are actually pretty dumb. I mean, narcissism itself is not an intelligent way of going through the world. It really isn't. So yeah, I don't see a correlation between narcissism and high IQ. Empathic types and high IQ. I've seen too many high IQ people who lack empathy altogether to say yes. So yeah, I would say no and no on that one. Richard needs auto-tune and reverb now. So true. Mary RB says, do you fear intimate love, Richard? No, Mary, I don't. I'm a big fan. I'm a big supporter of it. I think it's great. Tell me a story, says lol. I just come back from Liverpool. It's a special place. It is indeed. Happy One says, I disagree. They're known as exceedingly intelligent. Oh, I must have missed that piece of published, peer-reviewed research that you've read there, my mate. It must have slid by me. Okay, let's have some last questions, and let's make them ridiculous. Totally nonsensical questions, and then we'll finish. How can you navigate POA for an elderly member with a sister with MPD traits? I can't remember what POA is. In fact, I don't know if I've ever known what POA is. Sorry, I don't know what that is. Oh, did Amara come back? Amara, I was waiting for you, lad. Who's your favorite Batman actor? Now, this is the type of question I can get behind. Well, you know, these are the important questions. I'll always have a soft spot for Michael Keaton on that one. I think, yeah, Michael Keaton probably. Omar, I've missed you. Can anybody just repost Omar's question? Your top 5 books. Last year, I read 3 books. Well, I actually read 6 books by Cormac McCarthy. They weren't all gold dust, but No Country for Old Men, The Road, and Blood Meridian are 3 of the best books I've ever written. If we're going to talk American novelist, I'd actually say he's probably my favorite now, Cormac McCarthy. The Road is just an excellent, heart-wrenching book that's actually got a very strongly optimistic message. Blood Meridian, psychedelic, violent, chaotic, evocative. He's a craftsman at work. And No Country for Old Men is just a brilliant book. You can just hand over your consciousness to a master wordsmith and just live in his world for a period of time and be grateful. You're in good hands. He really knows what he's doing. He's a great writer. So I really enjoyed those 3. I read them all a couple of times last year. Really liked them. What else did I read? I read God's Child, which was really disturbing. I wouldn't recommend. That was really gross and disturbing. I read a couple of his other books as well, but those 3 are some of the best books I've ever read. Oh, here we go. Omar is 67. Finally, how do I know if my lizard brain is warning me or if it's glitching when a male neighbor gets too friendly too quickly? I was on red alert for several days. I couldn't really responsibly answer that question here. I think if I stay in my lane, I would say my most useful perspective for you, and I suggest you get advice from other people as well, would be to say, can we distinguish between, or can you learn to distinguish between an authentic, intuitive sense of where a person is coming from and an emotional flashback? And that's quite a conservative, small ambition that we can have. And it seems like a reasonable one. So you would feel confident then, after a period of time, where you could say, that's a real intuitive sense that this person is dangerous. And actually, this one is just an emotional flashback. Now, the only way to get that done is by reducing your emotional flashbacks and by developing your emotional literacy. The tutorials for doing that, I have some good ones over on Fortress Mental Health Protection System, which is a separate YouTube channel. It's all for free. I suggest you reduce the emotional flashbacks, develop your emotional literacy, and then you'll be able to distinguish between a true intuitive warning and an emotional flashback. What's the best movie with a narcissistic character in it? Well, I like a lot of gangster movies and criminal movies. So my favorite ones growing up, I really liked Clockwork Orange. The main character has NPD, Alex, at least. Natural Born Killers, both ultra narcissistic psychopaths, Mickey and Mallory Knox. Goodfellas is a study in, grandiose narcissism, fragile narcissism, borderline personality disorder, and psychopathy. The Godfather, Get Shorty is a good film that touches on some elements of it. Who's the best portrayal of a narcissist? Actually, the movie Gaslight isn't bad. It's weird because they're doing, in that period of time where they were sort of transitioning between theatre and film, and so everything was a little bit theatrical, and people are sort of talking to each other in a way that sounds rather odd and strange and weird, and they're delivering lines, and it's not very natural. It's still good, and the main guy in Gaslight is really genuinely creepy, and the lines he delivers, even though it's very theatrical and dated, it's classic for gaslighting and for MPD. So Gaslight is actually a good one. There are two. They're both black and white. Can't tell you which is the one that I prefer. Sorry about that. But that's pretty good, yeah. You on Netflix? Yeah, that would be boss, wouldn't it? Watched Silence of the Lambs last night. So good. Yeah, that's Jonathan Demme directed that. It's just a beautifully shot, beautifully edited film. Doesn't miss a beat. There's no duff lines. There's no bad choices in it. There was a sequence that I edited to make it fit on YouTube for a video, and it's when Clarice Starling first meets Hannibal Lecter, and the minutes before when she's being sent by her boss, whose name escapes me at the moment, and is being warned by Dr. Chilton, and then meets Hannibal Lecter. The pacing of that and the cuts in the edit, you know, when she meets Barney and Barney explains to her what to do, the sound, the color, everything is just, it's perfect. It's actually probably close to a perfect film, really. I've watched it so many times and I can't think of any bad scenes in it where you sort of go, oh, it was a bit, why did they, that was a weird decision. Everything is good, and it's tight. It's not over. It's not self-indulgent. It's like films now. I'm like, fucking hell, what are we doing? Like, why are we focused on that character? Why are we doing this? Why are we, I don't know if, let me sound old for a second. If you compare Blade Runner to Blade Runner 2049, it's like a study in weird choices. Blade Runner 2049, I'm just like, I'm constantly looking at the screen going, why are we doing this? Like, why is the shot set up like this? Why is the character doing that? And why should I care? Whereas in the original Blade Runner, it was shot in a way where it was, everything is compelling. Everything is you want to see what's going to happen next. Some people said they thought 2049 was good. I was like, God, this is awful. I'll tell you something else that's awful. Tenet. But I won't do a rant video. Tenet. God, it like epitomized everything wrong with modern cinema. What a pretentious load of, don't swear, Richard, of not very good filmmaking. Okay. So I guess we're probably at an end. Oh, Michelle D says Space Odyssey 2001. Yeah, that's a thinker. Watched it a few times. I know that he's saying something. I don't think it's pretentious tosh. I know he's saying something. I just don't think I'm getting what he's saying. I've got my little interpretations on the go so far, but I still don't think I've really grasped what Kubrick's point was with that. So, okay, folks, I think that's it. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention. I hope that was useful, and thank you for all your questions. Thank you for sticking with me. I really do appreciate it. It's nice. It's a privilege to be able to do this. So yeah, thank you very much. This will re-upload in a minute, and you can watch it back and play it back. Sorry if I didn't get to your questions, and I look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Cheers.